Welcome to Storytelling as a Fine Art. Today we're going to talk a little bit about the 9 parts of a story. Now, a lot of people historically have tried to figure out what are the parts of a story, and I'm going to give you my take on it, okay? Not W. Somerset Maugham's or anyone else's. I'm just going to go ahead and give you my take. Now, I like to think of a story, an outline to a story, as a roadmap. Imagine that you're going to take a trip around the world, and you could say, okay, we're going to go to Dublin first, and then we're going to go to Paris, France, and then we're going to go to Egypt, and then we're going to go to, and you can fill in the blanks of where you'd like to go. That's kind of what an outline to a story is. It's a broad, basic description of what the high points are going to be in your story. Now, here are a few traditional things about stories that are some of the 9 points that I'm going to throw in. First of all, most stories, in fact, pretty much every story I've ever read, has a setting of some kind. Now, when we think of a setting, you might think of a single setting, but the truth is that settings grow and change over the course of a novel. So that, for example, you might have 100 different scenes with 100 different settings, and that's actually a pretty standard number. So your world is your setting, your mega setting, and then you have those little miniature settings that you put in between. Second of all, every story has a character, usually a protagonist of some kind. The story that the character that the story's about. Okay. Now, when you have this character, that character isn't static either. Okay, characters grow and change throughout the course of a story. So you might start your story off with a story about a character who's an orphan. Okay, who travels to a strange new land and meets up with an old sage and becomes an apprentice to a young magician who then finds out that he's thrust into a war and suddenly he becomes a warrior and so on. Okay, each of those phases of that character's life require some manipulation, some require some care in your description of how that character grows and changes. By the way, if it sounds like I just described Star Wars, you could say that I did, or maybe I described Lord of the Rings, or maybe I described something like King Henry IV, Part 1 and 2. Okay, in other words, the heroic journey is much the same across a lot of different mythologies and different times and places. Then, of course, we get into the conflicts in the story. Now, conflicts start out, and they usually are small conflicts that grow into bigger things. In other words, just like the settings and the characters, the conflicts grow and change too. So you might have a character who starts out looking for the killer of his father, and as the story grows, and the character grows, he may have a conflict where he discovers that he is in love. Perhaps that mystery turns into a desire for revenge, etc., etc. So the conflicts grow and shift and change as the story grows. Those are the first 3 parts of your story, though: your setting, your character, and your conflict. Now, when we get into the fourth part of the story, this one's kind of optional, okay? And I say it's optional because you don't necessarily need it, but there's a certain part in a story where we discover what the big major conflict is, okay? And usually that happens during what's called the inciting incident. What makes the protagonist recognize that he or she is in for the fight of their lives, okay? That's the inciting conflict, and it should be a conflict that's so big and so exciting that it's kind of jaw-dropping, that you don't want to set the story down for at least a few chapters as you discover how this character is going to handle it. The next part of your story is called the first try-fail cycle, okay? The first attempt at resolving the problem. But what happens is, as the character tries to solve the problem, he normally discovers that the problem is bigger and more complex than he thought. In other words, he fails, or she fails, and things go awry there. Or sometimes the character may actually resolve the problem, seemingly, and discover that they've just created a bigger problem for themselves. Either way, that first attempt is called the first try-fail cycle. The second try-fail cycle arises as the character takes another stab at it. Usually that means that they have to get some training. They may have to bring more friends into the mix. They may have to struggle to find more emotional resources. Sometimes they've got to learn magic, or they've got to learn battle tactics, or they have to consult with higher authorities, that kind of thing. But in any case, that second try fail cycle is usually a failure too. We arrive then at the climax, okay, the big part of the story. Now, this is normally the last half of any novel, or close to the last half. And during this, the character is pretty much forced to make an all or nothing attempt to resolve their problem. That means that they marshal all of their friends, they get a lot more people into it. The conflict expands once again from the time that second try fail cycle happened to the major conflict. And usually the protagonist also starts recognizing that there's another whole conflict that they didn't even know about. It's usually a personal weakness, something that they have to confront in order for them to resolve this story successfully. We go through that into what's called the reversal, at the very high point of the climax, where the character suddenly understands the problem and is able to resolve it successfully. In other words, they snatch victory from the jaws of defeat. And then we move into the denouement. That's where we've been building up conflict after conflict throughout this entire story, and suddenly everything resolves back to a normal and kind of a stable state. That's a big part of your story too. And the last part of your story continues throughout the entire story. It's called the validation of your character. Okay? In other words, very often in the story, the character has misconceptions and beliefs about himself and about the world, and we find out that, gosh, that just wasn't right. In the validation, everything has changed, and we discover that the character is now on the right path. Validation often occurs not within the character himself, but when somebody off stage, or somebody that is in a position of authority, starts remarking upon what happened. For example, in the old Lone Ranger series, whenever the Lone Ranger was finished with the story, somebody would say, "Who was that masked man?" And all of a sudden in the distance you would hear the "Hi-ho Silver, away," and that told the viewer that, oh yeah, this show is over. We are done. In the same way, you'll see that over and over again. Very often at the high point of a story, for example, a villain will say to a protagonist, "You're stronger than I thought, in one way or another," or "You proved more resilient than I imagined," or etc. That's part of the validation process. The attempt from the author to let us know that this story has been resolved successfully, and somebody basically putting a seal of approval on it and saying, okay, the movie, the book is done.